from now, after we shut down the country like every other major power on this planet.
The World Health Organization says now the U.S. has the potential to become the new epicenter of the virus, with nearly 55,000 cases, more than 10,000 within the last 24 hours. The agency says the U.S. now represents 40% of all new cases worldwide. Combined with Europe, the Western world represents 85% of all new cases worldwide. We want very much to get to our next guest, who joins us now, I believe from the World Health Organization. Dan, am I correct? Dr. Bruce Aylward joins us now. Dr. Aylward, from your perspective, the president says we're going to open up by Easter. Our top expert, Dr. Fauci, says that's flexible. I think he might be receiving pressure from the president. So should the United States lock down, or what's the best guidance for the U.S. at this point?
Well, what we look at is what works and what have we seen work around the world. And right now, there's very, very few countries that have actually been able to reverse this epidemic and bring their cases down to a very low level. And in fact, the only country that's done that is China. And it did two fundamental things to achieve that. The first thing it did was it spaced the people, through shutdowns and lockdowns, et cetera, reducing the amount of societal contacts. It spaced the people. But the second fundamental thing that it did was to try to stop the chains of transmission by testing every single suspect case, by then isolating and making sure effective isolation of all the cases, and then quarantining of their close contacts. And it was that combination, not one piece or the other. Lockdowns slow down a virus like this. You have got to find those transmission chains, cut them to actually stop it.
At the rate of infection that we're seeing in the U.S., do you foresee the U.S. being able to reduce restrictions and guidelines in the next few weeks?
I think the data are going to tell us that as it unfolds. And, the U.S. is a gigantic country, so it's very difficult to say something is going to happen right across the whole country. You're going to see this evolve differently in each part of the country. And again, if I just go back for a second to China, you had the Wuhan experience, which was very, very unique, but you had 30 other provinces that learned from that moved very, very fast on the key functions that I just told you about. And as a result, they had very, very different outbreaks, and they were able to get functional again much more rapidly than we've seen in Wuhan, where it's run a full, we're nearly 3 months in now before they're lifting. It'll be about 2.5 months between when it first hit, when it put the first measures in place there, and when they actually lifted them.
Doctor, I want to show you a chart that we've been showing our audience this morning. I'm not sure if you can see it where you are, but this chart actually, it's the Johns Hopkins numbers, and that the Financial Times puts in every day. If we can zoom in, guys, like we did the last time, the United States obviously above everybody else now, above China, above Spain, and we're actually much closer to the line where we double every 2 days. There's another chart I'm not going to show here that shows New York City's rate of infection going straight up. What is, you see the United States and Spain and Italy. I wanted to ask, how if we separate and Americans get more aggressive on that, how long until that trend line starts to curve? Because we obviously are going to zoom past China and Italy and Spain within the next 2 days, actually.
Yeah. So the critical thing, when you've got a rapidly increasing rate of increase of disease like this, and you have fabulous experts, the best people in the world there in the U.S. guiding on this, people like Tony, it's just superb. But what you want to do, the first thing you've got to do is try and take the heat out of this thing, slow it down, and you've got to make it difficult for the virus. Remember, this is a virus, and as other speakers have said, this survives in people, and it's got to get from one person to another person, and every person in the U.S. has got to make it more difficult for that virus, which means that physical distancing people are talking about, which means the hand washing people are talking about, which means the respiratory precautions. Because if you do all of those things, you make it hard on the virus, you slow it down. Now, it takes a little time to see the impact of those. It can take as much as 2 weeks, even if you do it extremely well. Because remember, as soon as you put those in place, you already have a lot of people who've been exposed. They're incubating the disease, and that can take 1-2 weeks for the incubated disease, let's say, to manifest. So it can take a while for those measures to kick in, and that's very difficult for a population. It's very frustrating for a population, and it's really, really hard for the people, the leaders who have to guide a population through these kind of measures.
Doctor, we're going to stay with you. I'm going to thank John Meacham for being with us as we continue talking. Thank you so much, John. Doctor, you look at the chart, and what's remarkable to me is how East does not meet West. The difference between countries in the East and countries in Western civilization. And yes, we could say that China, of course, imposed restrictions that we can't in a democracy, but Japan is a democracy, South Korea a democracy, and you see that South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, these 4 Asian countries or city-states, were able to flatten the curve extraordinarily well. Talk about the difference between what's happened in Asia and what's happened in Europe and the United States.
Yeah, sure. As you may know, I actually spent 2 weeks in China at really the peak and just past the peak of the crisis there. And what I saw was an extraordinary effort. I also know the South Korean, we had South Koreans, Japanese, Singapore, Hong Kong folks all with us actually in that mission to China, where we really examined what was actually happening there, what was taking the heat out of this thing. And you know, what was most striking for me was the Asian society. It wasn't what I was being told in terms of the measures being imposed by government. It was the passion, the diligence, the sense of responsibility, the seriousness of the average Chinese. And I want to use that term very carefully because they weren't average. They were extraordinary people. But they were driven by a sense of collective responsibility for their elderly, for their population. And they just had an extraordinary understanding of the disease and a commitment to do what was ever necessary. You know, my translator, when I was in Wuhan, this was a young woman who was from another part of China, just happened to be in Wuhan on the day the lockdown came, and she was there for a month at that point. And I asked her, I said, wow, this must be really difficult. I saw her cell phone, and there was a picture of 2 gorgeous little kids on it. And I said, oh, I guess they're here with you, though. And she said, no, they're 1,000 kilometers away. But this is my duty. This is what we need to do. It's not about me as an individual. It's about us. And, you know, that was what enabled China and then South Korea, Japan, etc. Very similar. They're all doing the same thing. They are putting shutdowns in place where necessary to slow it down, but then they are mobilizing their whole population to help with the identification, testing, isolation, and then quarantine, and supporting people who are in quarantine. So it's a real movement in these countries to apply not just the big shutdowns, because that just slows it down, but also those other fundamental pieces, which take a massive mobilization of people to effectively, flatten it, as you're seeing there now. That's the big difference. It's the second piece of this, which is so important to bring your population with you to be able to implement.
Well, and of course, in unfortunately, the state of Florida, while we keep this chart up, we've been seeing pictures of spring break. We've seen pictures of hundreds and hundreds of students on sandbar. I had one person who took their boat past that sandbar telling me that he's lived here his entire life and it was the most crowded the sandbar ever was. That's while our rate is still going up. Golf courses across Florida,
New Orleans,
they can't actually. The tee times are more jammed. The golf courses are more jammed than ever. There's a real sense that what you saw in Asia, we're not seeing here. I want to show you the next chart, Doctor. And this is of cities and regions that have been impacted. And of course, you see Wuhan, Lombardia, Madrid, and Washington, London. But you look all the way to the left, my God, New York City, actually close to the line where the deaths will double every day. Talk about those trend lines in New York City, and if it is true, what I heard from health officials yesterday, that New York is actually going to end up being as bad as Italy or perhaps worse? Is it too late to avert that disaster?
I strongly believe you always fight your wars forward, right? And you are where you are in terms of the situation in New York. And the extraordinary measures that are being put in place are absolutely what's going to be needed as you go forward. This effort to create massive isolation capacity to be able to get sick people out of houses, out of cramped areas where they may be contributing to the disease. There's massive efforts to help people understand their role in transmission and to really slow this down. Because if you want to save lives in a crisis like this, part of it is treating the sick, yes. But the other thing is you have got to reduce the number of sick so that your health facilities, your fabulous doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, physios in New York can do their life-saving work. But you got to take some of the strain off them by taking some of the heat out of this thing, by properly isolating the mild cases as well, making sure everyone who has COVID know they have it. Because one of the dangers with this disease, they call it a mild illness, but the reality is people will get the virus, they may feel better a couple of days later, and then they think, well, now I'm fine, I can wander back out into society. But those healthy people who had mild disease can still shed that virus for 14 days, which means they could go back out and start this thing all over again. So, you've got to address all of those pieces if you want that trend line in New York to change. Can it change? Absolutely. But that requires all of the people of New York working with the governor, working with the mayor to get the measures that they know. They're saying the right things. They understand this disease.
Now, Dr. Bruce Elward, thank you very much for being on with us this morning.
Thank you so
and
much.
sharing your absolute expertise. So we've got a lot to talk to you. We're going to get to